Dobar dan. Most of you are Croatian, right? Yes. It's a great feeling to be back here in your wonderful country. And I usually come here during the summer, of course, as most Hungarians do. But now I realize that it's stunningly beautiful in the autumn as well. The sea is a wonderful color, so it's very nice to be among you here today. As Peter mentioned, ours is not a strictly speaking legal think tank, although there are many lawyers working for us. Like, of course, Peter, who is the operative director of the center and one of our chief lawyers. But I am not a lawyer. I am a geopolitician, and that means that I am a cynic. Otherwise, you do not understand international relations in the 21st century or any other. Can you shut that down, please? Thank you. Which means that I'm going to speak about the darker side of human rights. How human rights are used to manipulate people, and how human rights are actually used to manipulate international relations. We'll start with this sort of a fourth generation human rights, which are not really human rights, of course. One of the main problems we face today is the aggressive spread of gender and LGBTQ ideology. I don't think I have to explain this point very deeply here. Think of the various medical interventions that are being done on children and young people in North America and increasingly in Western Europe. I'm speaking about hormone therapy for pre-adolescent kids, 11, 12, 13 years old, and increasingly, unfortunately, real surgery with real scalpels on teenagers. So I think we all recognize that this is a danger. But nevertheless, the argument that trans rights are human rights is made with stunning regularity. You cannot go past Amnesty International's Twitter page without seeing this at least once a month. It seems absurd that this is that essentially a form of sexual wish fulfillment should somehow gain the status of a universal human right. A personal kink as a right that must be universally enforced and respected, never mind in the cases of some of the Hollywood starlets celebrated. How did we get here? The sexual nature underlying this claim and the policies or the ideology behind the LGBTQ and the gender movement is useful in showcasing the absurdity of their demands that it should be their human right to promote and advance their tastes and fantasies, regardless of how unacceptable or even repelling to most of us, most of the public, they might seem. But if you put aside the sexual aspect of this, there is a legitimate question here that we may address seriously. Are human rights merely human wants, wishes, aspirations that are elevated to the status where the state and society must endeavor to grant them? This is not a silly question, and let me explain why. Everyone wants to drink, to eat, to live. We typically refer to these wants as needs. That is because we recognize the absolute universal nature of these wants. People like us who live comfortable lives often forget the intense emotional feeling attached to these wants. But a nearly avoided accident will make it abundantly clear to any one of us that we crave to live. And these are also human rights, of course. The right to life, the right to food, and the right to clean water. They were among the very first to be recognized because of their universal nature and the strong emotional element every single human being feels when they are not available in sufficient quantities. But note here something important. The strong emotional attachment does not suffice alone for these things to become human rights. A heroin addict will crave his next dose with the same intensity as a man in the Sahara Desert might crave water. Yet the feeling of want being absolutely overwhelming, there is no right to heroin. Although some people at George Soros' foundations are probably working on a right to heroin right now, as we speak. But this is because the need is far from universal. And in fact, it stems from a behavior that we almost universally deplore as human beings. The heroinist's wants do not turn into rights, no matter how strong they are. Let us move away now from the physical realm, physical needs. The right to human dignity was also among the first to be recognized. Again, the explanation is relatively simple and straightforward here. We all wish to be treated with dignity. We aspire to be dignified. Religion, ethics eventually convinced most people that the best way to gaining dignity, preserving our own dignity, comes hand in hand with respecting the dignities of others. And suddenly, this has been recognized as a universal human right, the right to human dignity. This is now being abused, of course, by those very people who are currently working on the human rights to heroin. They will claim that, for instance, you need to respect the human dignity of a pedophile. And they imply that his sexual cravings are his human essence, his dignity. But that is not so. Crime, especially vile crime, must and is punished without violating the human dignity of the criminal. We no longer torture. On this continent, at least, we no longer kill the criminals. But we do punish them. Indeed, a moral argument can be made that the punishment is required not just for the human dignity of the victims, but also for the human dignity of the perpetrator. Dostoevsky has more on this, if we are still allowed to read him in the 21st century. And one last example, the right to housing. This is not an ancient right, despite the fact that there is a strong wish in all of us to find shelter where we can feel safe and secure. Why is it that it took until the second half of the 20th century for this to become a human right? It's an interesting question. This has to do with a certain pragmatism on human beings, on behalf of all of us. The states that we instituted among ourselves were for a very long time unable to guarantee this right to everyone. We simply accepted this limitation of the state, of governments, as a given. This, however, does not mean that the right of housing did not exist. Indeed, if you want to be philosophical about this, human rights have always existed. They are not created by man. They are merely recognized by man at certain points in time. And the right to housing is actually such a right, and it's a very good example in that sense. Because the right to housing was there in a different guise. One of the first duties of families was always to provide a safe place for family members. Religious communities always felt obliged to provide shelter to those without families. And even the traditions of hospitality, which remain to this day quite strong in some cultures, served this very purpose. However, this can be taken too far as well. The right to safe and secure housing does not mean that a convicted criminal has a right to a cushy couch, a flat-screen TV, a jacuzzi, and a free internet. That's absurd. But if you look at the conditions, for example, under which they keep Anders Breivik, Norway's most infamous mass murderer, you really do have to wonder. And you do have to wonder when you look at the various human rights organizations demanding better and better conditions for criminals in European prisons. As I mentioned, it is an element of human dignity to punish the crime, to punish the criminal. And his dignity is somewhat restored when he goes through that punishment. So, ladies and gentlemen, human rights are intimately connected to human wants, aspirations, and needs. There's no need to deny this at all. But only legitimate needs. Only to those wants we, or at least a vast majority of us, understand, can relate to, and approve of. This is why and how they are universal. The rest remain just wants and desires, nothing more. No, a drag queen does not have the human right to enter a kindergarten and start brainwashing children. Nor do I have the human right to kick him out with a steel-plated boot. Those are just desires. And now moving on to the second part, and this is perhaps even darker. This is my field, geopolitics. Human rights have become an important element of international politics by the late 20th century. The doctrine of humanitarian intervention, which asserts that severe human rights violations justify the abrogation of national sovereignty, has become a hallmark of liberal and left opinion on international affairs. And we need to include some conservatives in this, especially in the late 20th century and early 21st century in the United States. The neoconservative movement very much espoused humanitarian intervention as a basis for foreign policy. Denial of personal and political freedoms was also deemed grounds for intervention, including military intervention, in the affairs of other countries. The defense of human rights became an occasion for the display of what some might call first world arrogance. And in many cases, it led to deeper tragedy. To call the supposed enemies of freedom and human rights the new Hitlers and the new fascism immediately signals evil. And there's a disturbing trend here. 30 years ago, it was a horrible dictator like Saddam Hussein who was called a new fascist. Today, a very democratic, freedom-loving woman in Italy who has been elected prime minister is regularly called a fascist. So the situation is getting worse in this sense. A variant of this theme is the analogy between Muslim fundamentalism and Nazi Germany. Nobody in this room actually likes Islamic radicalism, I am quite sure of that. But this Islamofascism thing is an example of everything being compared to Hitler. There are different shades and different kinds of evil. They don't have to be all the same. And when you reduce everything to Hitler, you oversimplify things. You do not understand the complexities. You cannot deal with radical Islamic terrorism the same way you treated with Nazis. They are just different types of evil. They need different solutions. Under the theory of justifiable intervention, governments that commit gross violations of human rights are set to forfeit any claims to the protection normally offered by sovereignty against intervention, which means the complete dismantling of the Westphalian system of international relations that served Europe very well for a very long time. Okay, let's take a look at some practical examples when some foreign policy decisions were based on humanitarian considerations and a claim to restoring human rights was made. Let's start with Iraq in 1990. Now, the intervention was perfectly justifiable by the fact that Iraq invaded the sovereign nation of Kuwait. Kuwait needed to be liberated from Iraq, and there was a UN Security Council resolution supporting this. So there was, in principle, no need for a human rights interpretation. Nevertheless, one was given for the purposes of convincing the American public that they should support the war. They were quite hesitant to support it in 1990. The memories of Vietnam were still fresh. Do you remember the girl called Naira? Naira was a 15-year-old girl who appeared before the Congressional Human Rights Caucus on the Capitol. She recalled the trauma of watching Iraqi troops storm into a hospital in Kuwait City, and the Iraqis had removed 312 babies from the incubators and left them to die on the cold floor. Many publications, such as the New York Times and rights groups like Amnesty International, echoed her disturbing eyewitness account. The problem is, she was lying. None of it was true. Naira was actually the daughter of the Kuwaiti ambassador to the United States. None of us should blame her. She was a patriot of her country. She did what was necessary. But perhaps we can blame some of the senators who invited her, because they knew who she was and they knew that her story was not true. Okay, moving on to the next one. Do you have any rotten tomatoes in the room? Hopefully not. I'm going to be speaking about Kosovo and Serbs, which is a bit of a dangerous subject in Croatia, I understand. In this room, nobody needs explaining how horrible the Milosevic regime was. Everybody has relatives in this room who suffered from the war. probably you lost some of your relatives as well. Serbia was a dark dictatorship under the Milosevic regime. That is not in doubt. It is not in doubt that there were legitimate justifications for the air campaign against Yugoslavia in 1999. One of the reasons was that such a dark dictatorship, such a violent regime should not be tolerated on the European continent. Nevertheless, again, human rights considerations were given, and in fact, they played a major role in the Kosovo intervention in 1999. And all of these are true. 300,000 Kosovo Albanians, more than 300,000, were driven from their homes. The forced displacement, combined with the pattern of human rights abuses and the track record of the Milosevic regime in Bosnia and Croatia, supported the argument that there were substantial grounds for humanitarian intervention. None of this is in doubt. The intervention was successful. The Serbian security forces were driven out of Kosovo. The problem comes now. What happened next? After the war, some 100,000 Serbs were forced to flee the province, and many have been murdered. Systemic attacks upon the Serbian population, and to a lesser degree upon other majority groups, suggested that at least some elements of the ethnic Albanian majority were determined to rid the province of all non-Albanians. So, a military intervention that was primarily justified on humanitarian grounds, on protecting human rights, resulted in a different kind of violation of human rights. They prevented one sort, but opened the door to something very similar, which happened after the intervention. Afghanistan and the concept of just war. Again, perfectly good grounds why the United States of America and the NATO allies had a right to intervene in Afghanistan. After all, it was the source of the 9/11 attack, and the war could be argued to be defensive in nature. Eliminating the Al-Qaeda connection in Afghanistan, it was a perfectly legitimate political and war goal. Nevertheless, the concept of just war had to be introduced due to humanitarian considerations. The doctrine's two main components relate to the decision or right to go to war, jus ad bellum, and the conduct during the war, jus in bello. The conduct during the war is basically your Geneva Convention, so we're not going to dwell on that for the sake of brevity, but let's go through jus ad bellum conditions, because they are interesting. There must be a just cause to go to war, and this was the case in Afghanistan in 2001, in my estimation. The second one, the decision ought to be made by a legitimate authority. And you would think that, okay, that condition is also satisfied. The United States got attacked. The United States government decided to retaliate at the source of the attack. However, it is the right of Congress to declare war. It is not the right of the president under the American Constitution. It would be wise to return to that. Force is to be used only with the right intention and as the last resort. Was it the last resort? I don't know. Maybe it was. The intentions were probably right. There must be a reasonable hope of success with peace as an expected outcome. Now, if you look back to the 20 years of the Afghan war, was there a reasonable hope of success back in 2001? Maybe there was, but the plans for that success were not in place. They did not have sufficient planning, and as a result, they could not expect to achieve peace within a reasonable time period. The use of force must be proportionate and discriminate. Now, we hear a lot in the press about bombed weddings and stuff like that, but in general, the American military is good in trying to limit civilian casualties, so I would not blame them too much on this point. The most important part is that maybe they had humanitarian intentions. Maybe they had human rights in their mind when they were operating in Afghanistan. And there are a lot of human rights violations now, and they were even more before 2001. But the intervention did not solve the problem, and we are now right back to where we started. Okay, I'll just skip Iraq, the second Iraq war, because you know all about that perfectly well. And let's go to Libya, because there's an interesting point there. The Libyan intervention in 2011 was almost entirely justified based on the concept of preserving human rights and the idea of humanitarian intervention. The Security Council resolution actually said, and I quote here, to protect civilians and civilian populated areas under threat of attack. Now what happened in reality? In reality, the Allied troops went after Gaddafi himself. The alliance routinely bombed Gaddafi's suspected residence, including one attack that reportedly killed the Libyan leader's son and 3 of his grandchildren. President Obama warned in March 28 address to the nation that dictatorial impulses would be eclipsed by the darkest form of dictatorship, as repressive leaders concluded that violence is the best strategy to cling to power. This was another rationale that was offered, that if Gaddafi was allowed to succeed somehow, then other dictators would draw the conclusion that violence is their only tool. But ladies and gentlemen, dictators always assume that violence is their first and most useful tool. The Libyan intervention did not change that. The Libyan intervention, however, did leave a country in absolute chaos, where, you know the story, modern slavery. They buy and sell people there. They torture women. Libya is in a horrible state. And the other consequence of that intervention was in the realm of nuclear non-proliferation. Other dictators in Iran and North Korea concluded quite understandably that their only guarantee against Western intervention comes from owning nuclear weapons. They concluded this because Libya and Gaddafi was attacked after they agreed to give up their nuclear project. They hoped to gain economic advantages from the West, and they hoped to gain security guarantees. They were promised security advantages, and they were never promised. They were promised economic advantages. They were never promised on-paper security guarantees. But one can imagine that in the hallways of diplomacy there were winks and nods. Eventually, they didn't get all that many advantages in the economic sphere, and of course, security-wise, if the dictator of North Korea looks at the fate of Gaddafi, there is only one conclusion that he can make. Now, I was castigating the United States here and the West over these dark side of using human rights to manipulate international affairs. But they are sort of the better cases. There are worse cases than this, much worse. If you look at the 3 Russian interventions in the last decade, 2008 in Georgia, 2014 in the southeast of Ukraine and Crimea, now, and even during their Syrian campaign. We don't hear this because the Western press, quite justifiably, does not put it to us, to the wider public. But among the most important justifications, the Kremlin always listed human rights abuses. Human rights abuses. Some of them might have happened, but most of them were just simply made up. There was a horrible story from 2014 of a Donetsk kid, less than 14 years old, who was crucified by the Ukrainian Nazis. None of that is true, of course. But this should be an example, an indication that if we Western countries sometimes abuse the humanitarian argument for foreign policy, then our adversaries will abuse it even more. If you open this door, and it has been opened, it will be kicked even wider open, and dangers follow. As young leaders, I would like to leave you with one final thought in this regard. Human rights are extremely important. They are the basis of our dignity. But be mindful of what really are human rights. Human rights are those rights that have been signed and ratified in various international documents. Those are rights that we all, or at least over 90% of all human beings, can agree that are justifiable human aspirations. Those are the human rights. And when a diplomat in the UN starts using the human rights argument, be very cautious that very moment and suspect every motive that he is going to have beyond that. Diplomats rarely are genuinely concerned about human rights. It's us here in this room who are, and we are the ones who should force them to be more concerned about the real human rights. Thank you very much.
much.